The morning of October 15th, 2025, brought an unusual chill to the Philadelphia County Courthouse, despite the autumn sun streaming through the tall windows of Courtroom 4B. The air conditioning hummed steadily, but the coldness that would permeate the room over the next several hours had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with the testimony that was about to unfold. District Attorney Lawrence Pemberton adjusted his tie as he reviewed his notes one final time, the weight of the case pressing heavily on his shoulders. Across the mahogany-paneled courtroom, defense attorney Diana Hutchinson whispered urgently to her client, 38-year-old Pauline Greenfield, whose expression remained disturbingly placid despite the gravity of the charges she faced. The defendant sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun, wearing a navy blazer that seemed carefully chosen to project respectability. Judge Howard Blackstone entered through the side door, his black robes flowing behind him as the bailiff called the court to order. At 62 years old, Judge Blackstone had presided over hundreds of criminal cases during his 20-year tenure on the bench. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to witness. The gallery was packed with reporters, victims' rights advocates, and curious members of the public who had followed the case through its pre-trial proceedings. The jury, 7 women and 5 men, sat attentively in the jury box, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The case concerned the death of 23-year-old Jessica Greenfield, who had been found deceased in her apartment on March 18, 2025. Initial investigations suggested natural causes, but inconsistencies in the timeline and troubling statements from witnesses prompted a deeper investigation. What emerged was a disturbing pattern of behavior from Pauline Greenfield, the victim's mother, whose financial troubles and strained relationship with her daughter had escalated in the months before Jessica's death. District Attorney Pemberton rose to begin his opening statement, his voice steady and measured as he addressed the jury. He outlined how the prosecution would demonstrate that Pauline Greenfield had administered a fatal dose of prescription medication to her daughter, motivated by a substantial life insurance policy that Jessica had taken out when she started her first professional job. The prosecutor explained that the evidence would show a calculated plan executed with chilling precision and followed by behavior that defied normal human emotion. Defense attorney Hutchinson countered that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence and misinterpreted grief responses. She argued that Pauline Greenfield was a loving mother, devastated by the sudden loss of her only child, and that different people process trauma in different ways. The attorney emphasized that unusual emotional responses should not be mistaken for guilt, citing psychological research on trauma and grief manifestations. As the opening statements concluded, Judge Blackstone called for a 15-minute recess before testimony would begin. The courtroom buzzed with hushed conversations as spectators processed what they had just heard. The prosecution's first witness would be Detective Raymond Fletcher from the Philadelphia Police Department's Homicide Division, who had led the investigation that transformed Jessica Greenfield's death from a closed case to a homicide prosecution. When court reconvened, Detective Fletcher took the stand, raising his right hand to be sworn in. The 51-year-old detective had 28 years of experience in law enforcement, and his testimony would establish the foundation for the prosecution's case. District Attorney Pemberton approached the witness stand, maintaining the appropriate distance as required by courtroom protocol. Detective Fletcher, can you describe the initial call that brought you to the apartment at 847 Chestnut Street on March 18, 2025? Pemberton asked, his voice carrying clearly across the courtroom. The detective consulted his notes and responded, "We received a call at approximately 11:47 a.m. from Pauline Greenfield, reporting that she had found her daughter unresponsive in the apartment they shared. When officers arrived at 12:03 p.m., paramedics were already on scene and had pronounced the victim deceased. Pemberton continued his examination, walking Detective Fletcher through the initial investigation. The detective described finding Jessica Greenfield in her bedroom, positioned naturally on her bed, as if she had passed away in her sleep. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious trauma, and the scene appeared unremarkable at first glance. However, the detective testified that something about Pauline Greenfield's demeanor had immediately struck him as unusual. "Can you elaborate on what you observed about the defendant's behavior?" Pemberton asked, moving to introduce a series of photographs into evidence. Detective Fletcher shifted in his seat, his expression grave. "In my nearly 3 decades of experience, I've witnessed every possible reaction to sudden death. Shock, denial, hysteria, numbness. But Mrs. Greenfield displayed something different. She was calm, almost detached. She answered questions in a matter-of-fact manner and showed no visible signs of distress." Defense attorney Hutchinson immediately objected, arguing that the detective's observations about emotional responses were subjective and prejudicial. Judge Blackston sustained the objection in part, instructing the jury that they should consider emotional responses in context and that people react differently to trauma. The judge's instruction reflected current understanding in psychological research about trauma responses and their variability across individuals. The prosecution proceeded to establish the timeline of events. Detective Fletcher testified that according to Pauline Greenfield's initial statement, Jessica had complained of feeling unwell the evening before, on March 17th. The mother claimed she had checked on her daughter around 10 p.m. and Jessica was sleeping peacefully. Pauline stated she discovered her daughter unresponsive the following morning when Jessica failed to emerge for breakfast. District Attorney Pemberton then introduced phone records showing that Pauline Greenfield had made several calls in the hours after Jessica's death, but notably, the call to emergency services came nearly 45 minutes after she had called her financial advisor. Detective Fletcher testified that when questioned about this discrepancy, Pauline had explained she wanted to understand Jessica's financial affairs before authorities became involved. The detective's testimony continued through the afternoon, describing how the initial autopsy revealed elevated levels of zolpidem, a common sleep medication, in Jessica's system. While the levels were not immediately flagged as suspicious, they were higher than therapeutic doses. Combined with the circumstantial evidence and Pauline's unusual behavior, the medical examiner recommended further toxicological analysis. On cross-examination, Diana Hutchinson challenged the detective's interpretation of events. She pointed out that having elevated medication levels did not prove homicide, as Jessica could have accidentally taken too much medication while feeling unwell. The defense attorney also questioned whether Detective Fletcher had allowed his subjective impressions of Pauline's emotional state to bias his investigation. Detective Fletcher, "Isn't it true that you formed a negative opinion of my client within the first hour of meeting her based solely on her lack of visible tears?" Hutchinson asked, her tone sharp. The detective maintained his composure. "I formed no opinion initially. I simply noted observations that, combined with other evidence, warranted further investigation." Judge Blackston called for the day's adjournment at 5:15 p.m., instructing the jury not to discuss the case or conduct any independent research. As the courtroom emptied, reporters rushed to file their stories, and the prosecution team huddled to review the next day's witness list. The foundation had been laid, but the most disturbing testimony was yet to come. October 16, 2025, dawned with overcast skies that matched the somber mood inside courtroom 4B. The gallery filled even earlier than the previous day, as word had spread that Pauline Greenfield herself would take the stand. The decision to have a defendant testify in their own defense was always risky, but Diana Hutchinson had determined it was necessary to humanize her client and provide alternative explanations for the prosecution's evidence. The morning began with testimony from Dr. Angela Morrison, the forensic pathologist who had conducted Jessica Greenfield's autopsy. Dr. Morrison, a board-certified forensic pathologist with 15 years of experience, explained her findings in clinical detail. The initial examination showed no signs of physical trauma, no defensive wounds, and no indication of struggle. Jessica appeared to be a healthy young woman who had simply stopped breathing during the night. However, Dr. Morrison continued, adjusting her glasses as she referenced her report. The toxicology screening revealed zolpidem levels of 0.4 milligrams per liter in the blood. While not extraordinarily high, this level, combined with the circumstances, suggested the possibility of intentional overdose, either self-administered or given by another party. District Attorney Pemberton pressed for clarification. Dr. Morrison, based on your expertise, was the level of medication in Jessica Greenfield's system consistent with a therapeutic dose? The pathologist shook her head. The therapeutic range for zolpidem is typically 0.08 to 0.15 milligrams per liter. Jessica's levels were approximately 3 times the upper therapeutic limit. This suggests she ingested significantly more than the prescribed dosage. On cross-examination, Hutchinson challenged whether the levels definitively proved homicide. Dr. Morrison acknowledged that people experiencing severe stress or insomnia sometimes took extra medication without fully understanding the risks. The defense attorney also elicited testimony that there were no other drugs or alcohol in Jessica's system that would have created a dangerous interaction. Following Dr. Morrison's testimony, the prosecution called Jessica's co-worker Denise Holloway, who worked with the victim at a marketing firm downtown. Denise, 25 years old with auburn hair and red-rimmed eyes, clearly struggled to maintain her composure on the stand. She testified about conversations with Jessica in the weeks before her death, during which Jessica had expressed growing concern about her mother's financial demands. Jessica told me her mother kept asking about the life insurance policy through work, Denise said, her voice breaking. She said her mom wanted to be listed as the beneficiary, but Jessica had designated it to a children's charity instead. She felt uncomfortable with how persistent her mother was being about it. This testimony established motive. Pauline Greenfield had believed she would receive a substantial payout upon her daughter's death, unaware that Jessica had changed the beneficiary designation just 6 weeks before her passing. District Attorney Pemberton introduced employment records showing the policy was worth $250,000, a significant sum for someone facing the financial pressures that evidence would show Pauline was experiencing. After the lunch recess, the moment everyone had anticipated arrived. Diana Hutchinson stood and announced, "The defense calls Pauline Greenfield to the stand." A murmur rippled through the gallery as Pauline rose from the defense table. She moved to the witness stand with measured steps, her expression neutral, almost serene. She wore a grey dress with a pearl necklace, presenting an image of middle-class respectability. As she raised her right hand to take the oath, several jurors leaned forward, their attention completely focused on this woman, accused of killing her own daughter. Hutchinson began with background questions, establishing that Pauline had been a single mother who had raised Jessica alone after divorcing when the child was 7. Pauline described their relationship as close, particularly during Jessica's childhood and teenage years. Her voice remained steady and controlled as she answered these preliminary questions. "Mrs. Greenfield, can you describe your relationship with Jessica in the months before her death?" Hutchinson asked. Pauline's face showed a faint smile, which struck many observers as deeply inappropriate given the subject matter. "Jessica was my whole world," she said, her tone oddly flat despite the words. "We had lived together for 23 years. She was my daughter, my companion, my best friend." The defense attorney walked Pauline through the events of March 17th and 18th. Pauline testified that Jessica had come home from work complaining of a headache and exhaustion. She said she had prepared soup for dinner, which Jessica ate only partially before retiring to her room around 8:30 p.m. According to Pauline's account, she checked on Jessica around 10:10 p.m., found her sleeping, and went to her own room. "The next morning, when Jessica didn't come out for breakfast, I went to check on her," Pauline continued, that same unsettling smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I opened her door and saw her lying peacefully in bed. I called her name, but she didn't respond. I approached and touched her arm, and it was cold." Several jurors shifted uncomfortably as Pauline described discovering her daughter's body with no visible emotion, her facial expression remaining eerily calm. The disconnect between the horrific content of her words and her effective presentation created a disturbing cognitive dissonance in the courtroom. Hutchinson asked about the phone calls made that morning. Pauline explained that she had been in shock and had called her financial advisor because she suddenly realized she would need to handle Jessica's affairs. She maintained that she called emergency services as soon as she gathered her thoughts. Her explanation was plausible on its surface, but the continued absence of appropriate emotion undermined its credibility. Then came the moment that would define the trial and haunt everyone present. Hutchinson asked Pauline to describe her feelings about Jessica's death. Pauline tilted her head slightly, and her smile widened, not in a grotesque or exaggerated way, but in a manner that suggested mild contentment, as if she were discussing a pleasant memory rather than her daughter's death. "Jessica is at peace now," she said, her voice maintaining that same flat, affectless quality. "She struggled so much with anxiety and stress from work. Now she doesn't have to worry about anything anymore." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Even Judge Blackston, known for his unflappable demeanor, appeared visibly disturbed by the defendant's presentation. The jurors' faces registered shock, confusion, and in some cases, clear revulsion. This was not numbness or dissociation, psychological responses to trauma that would have been understandable, but rather an apparent satisfaction that defied normal human emotional responses to the loss of one's child. Hutchinson quickly attempted to redirect, asking Pauline about her grief and how she had been coping. But the damage was done. Pauline's subsequent answers, delivered in that same eerily calm manner with periodic inappropriate smiles, only reinforced the disturbing impression. When District Attorney Pemberton rose for cross-examination, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. He approached carefully, knowing that the defendant had already severely damaged her own case, but wanting to cement certain facts for the jury. "Mrs. Greenfield, you testified that you and Jessica were very close," Pemberton began. "Yet Jessica's co-workers, friends, and diary entries that we've entered into evidence all describe increasing conflict between you, particularly regarding money. How do you explain that discrepancy?" Pauline's expression remained unchanged. "Every mother and daughter have disagreements," she replied. "It didn't mean we weren't close." Pemberton introduced bank statements showing that Pauline had been facing potential eviction and had accumulated significant credit card debt. He established that she had repeatedly asked Jessica for financial help, which Jessica had initially provided but eventually refused. Text messages between mother and daughter showed Jessica expressing frustration with her mother's spending habits and refusing to enable what she called financial irresponsibility. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Greenfield, that you believed you would inherit money from Jessica's life insurance policy?" Pemberton asked. Jessica told me I was her beneficiary, Pauline responded, still smiling slightly. I had no reason to think otherwise. The prosecutor then revealed evidence that Pauline had been in Jessica's email account, something the defendant had not disclosed, and had seen correspondence about the life insurance policy just days before Jessica's death. While the emails didn't explicitly state who the beneficiary was, they referenced the policy and its value. Pemberton's final line of questioning focused on the night of March 17th. He walked Pauline through her timeline, step by step, highlighting inconsistencies between her testimony and physical evidence. Security footage from their apartment building showed Pauline entering Jessica's room at 11:30 p.m., 90 minutes later than she had claimed. Phone records showed she had researched zolpidem overdose symptoms at 1:15 a.m. on March 18th, hours before she claimed to have discovered Jessica's body. As Pemberton presented each piece of contradictory evidence, Pauline's explanations became increasingly strained, though her emotional affect never changed. She maintained the same slight smile, the same flat tone, even as the prosecutor systematically dismantled her account. "Mrs. Greenfield," Pemberton said, his voice heavy with controlled intensity, "can you explain why you showed more emotion when discussing your credit card bills than when describing finding your daughter's body?" Hutchinson objected immediately, arguing the question was prejudicial. Judge Blackston overruled the objection, noting that the defendant's demeanor was relevant to her credibility as a witness. Pauline paused, her smile finally faltering for just a moment before returning. "I don't know what you mean," she said quietly. "Everyone grieves differently." The cross-examination concluded at 4:30 p.m., leaving the courtroom in a state of collective unease. Pauline Greenfield had not helped her case. If anything, her testimony had transformed what might have been a circumstantial evidence challenge into a visceral demonstration of something deeply wrong. The jurors had seen with their own eyes the chilling disconnect between a mother's words about her daughter's death and the complete absence of appropriate emotional response. Judge Blackston announced that closing arguments would be heard the following morning, October 17th, followed by jury instructions and deliberations. As the courtroom emptied, reporters rushed to their news desks with descriptions of the most disturbing testimony many had ever witnessed. The question was no longer just whether Pauline Greenfield had killed her daughter, but what kind of person could describe such a tragedy with a smile. The jury deliberated for 7 hours over 2 days before reaching a verdict on October 20th, 2025. When they returned to courtroom 4B, the forewoman, a 54-year-old high school teacher, announced they had found Pauline Greenfield guilty of first-degree homicide. As the verdict was read, Pauline maintained the same eerily calm expression that had characterized her testimony, showing no visible reaction to the decision that would determine the rest of her life. Judge Blackston scheduled sentencing for October 29, 2025. At that hearing, he sentenced Pauline Greenfield to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, citing the calculated nature of the crime and the defendant's complete lack of remorse. In his sentencing statement, the judge noted that in his 2 decades on the bench, he had never encountered a defendant whose presentation had been so profoundly disturbing. The $250,000 life insurance benefit was paid to the children's charity Jessica had designated, fulfilling her wishes and ensuring her mother could not profit from her death. Jessica's friends established a scholarship fund in her name at her alma mater, Temple University, specifically for students pursuing careers in marketing and communications. Forensic psychologists who reviewed the case afterward offered various theories about Pauline Greenfield's behavior, ranging from severe personality disorders to emotional detachment as a psychological defense mechanism. However, prosecutors maintained that her actions, from the planning to the execution to the aftermath, demonstrated calculated intent rather than mental illness. The trial sparked broader conversations about how the justice system evaluates emotional responses and the danger of using unconventional grief presentations as evidence of guilt. Mental health professionals emphasized that while Pauline's demeanor was certainly unusual, it was the totality of evidence, the financial motive, the timeline inconsistencies, the internet searches, and the physical evidence that established guilt beyond reasonable doubt. For those who witnessed Pauline Greenfield's testimony, whether in person or through media coverage, the image of a smiling mother describing her daughter's death remained a haunting reminder that sometimes the most disturbing evil wears an ordinary face. The case served as a sobering example of how financial desperation can corrupt familial bonds and how the justice system must look beyond surface presentations to uncover truth. Jessica Greenfield's story, tragically cut short at 23, became a catalyst for discussions about life insurance, beneficiary notifications, and family financial dynamics. Her memory lives on, not in the courtroom where her mother was convicted, but in the charitable work funded by her foresight and the scholarship that helps other young people pursue their dreams. The trial concluded, justice was served, and Pauline Greenfield began her life sentence at the State Correctional Institution on October 31, 2025. The courtroom returned to its regular schedule of cases, but those who had been present for those 3 days in October would never forget the chilling testimony of a mother who smiled while describing her daughter's death.